All right, well, hello everyone. So we're going to start here with part 2 of our endocrine system lecture, and we're going to begin looking at specific endocrine glands, organs, as well as their hormones and the various effects of those hormones. So first thing is just a general tip, right? So as we go through and we talk about these various endocrine organs and glands, and we talk about their hormones, consider the name of the hormone. Pay attention to the actual name because the name tells you something about the hormone, right? So it's going to tell you maybe where it's made, maybe not directly, but maybe indirectly after I give you a few hints and tricks to remember. It may tell you where it goes, and then it may tell you what it stimulates, right? So consider these things about the hormone's name as we talk about this, right? So first thing that we'll look at is something called the pituitary, right? The pituitary is connected to another structure called the hypothalamus through something called the infundibulum. If you recall from your skeletal anatomy, the sphenoid bone, there is a little depression in the sphenoid bone called the hypophyseal fossa, which is just this bony depression in the sphenoid bone, and in that depression you have the pituitary gland itself. So if you look at a skull model, you can see this hypophyseal fossa very, very easily, right? The infundibulum, this is a connecting stalk that connects the pituitary to the hypothalamus, and we'll look at that. We'll look at an image of that in just a moment. The pituitary gland itself is divided into an anterior and posterior. You can see here both anterior and posterior. The two different parts of the hypothalamus, pituitary, excuse me, the anterior and posterior, they produce different hormones, and so you'll need to understand and learn which hormones come from which part of the pituitary, which come from anterior, which come from posterior, right? Now you'll also see the posterior called the neurohypophysis. So anytime you see this term hypophysis, this is referring to pituitary. So like the hypophyseal fossa is the fossa for the hypophysis for the pituitary. The neurohypophysis, the posterior pituitary, this term neuro indicates that it's made up of nervous tissue. So there are neurons that project into the posterior pituitary, as we will see. And then in this pituitary, it is going to, in some cases, make hormones, and in some cases, it's going to store hormones, right? So in the case of the anterior, it will produce its own hormones. The posterior pituitary, rather, it only stores hormones, right? So it's not actually going to make any, but it's going to store them and then release them, and we'll look at a few of those here on this slide. So if we look here, we can see something called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, right? So this tract is essentially just a connection between two regions. So one is going to be the hypothalamus, one is going to be the pituitary, and of course they're connected via this infundibulum, that connecting stalk, right? So in the hypothalamus you have various nuclei, right? Recall that nuclei in the nervous system are simply collections of cell bodies, right? Inside the central nervous system, if it's a nucleus. So two main nuclei here, you have what are called the paraventricular and the supraoptic nucleus, right? One of these is named very intuitively. This is called the optic chiasm. This is where your optic nerves cross and become optic tracts as they move posterior into the brain. And sitting just above it, you have this nucleus. So you call this the nucleus that sits above this optic chiasm. You call it the supraoptic nucleus, right? And it's producing ADH. The paraventricular nucleus is producing something called oxytocin, right? Both of those, after they're produced, they move down into the posterior pituitary via axonal transport. So they move down these axons through the infundibulum, and then they are stored in the posterior pituitary, and then they'll ultimately be released from the posterior pituitary. But big thing, they're not made there, right? They're made in the hypothalamus, okay? Whenever we look at the anterior pituitary actually makes its own set of hormones, right? And we will look at various hormones as well, and even coming from even the hypothalamus itself. There are hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus that then stimulate the release of hormones in the anterior pituitary, right? Now, For the posterior, as we said, you have that hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, right? For the anterior pituitary, you have something similar, but instead of utilizing neurons, it's going to utilize blood vessels, right? So you have something called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system, okay? Now, importantly, a portal system is a network of blood vessels that essentially begins and ends with capillaries, okay? So you start with capillaries, you have some blood vessels, and then you have another set of capillaries, right? That is unlike other sets of blood vessels in which you have a main vessel, maybe you have an artery, and then you have a capillary, and then you have a vein, right? So you only have one capillary bed. For a portal system, you'll have two, right? You'll have two. So for this portal system, I'm going to show you an image here. Here you have one set of capillaries, right, kind of associated with the infundibulum and the hypothalamus. You have these portal veins that are extending down from the infundibulum to the anterior pituitary, and then you have your second set of capillaries, right, the secondary plexus, right? And again, this is associated with the anterior pituitary, right? So what's traveling down this portal system, this hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system, and again, it's telling you this is connecting hypothalamus to the hypophysis, to the pituitary, are all of these hormones here, right? Now, you'll notice here, all of these are called either releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones, okay? So they end in RH or they end in IH, okay? So thyrotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone inhibiting hormone, right? So helpful hint here, just like I mentioned on one of the first slides, if a hormone has the word releasing or inhibiting, it comes from the hypothalamus. Okay, very, very easy to remember. If it has releasing or inhibiting, it's coming from the hypothalamus, right? If it has those terms, releasing or inhibiting, and it comes from the hypothalamus, you know that it's going to stimulate some hormone release from the anterior pituitary. Okay, anterior pituitary, and often the names are associated with each other, right? So meaning thyrotropin releasing hormone stimulates the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, right? You may have growth hormone inhibiting hormone inhibits the release of growth hormone, right? Corticotropin releasing hormone stimulates the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, right? So the names are paired with each other in a way that makes pretty good sense, right? So let's go back for a second and let's take a look at some details of some various hormones that we've already mentioned, right? So first are these that are coming from the hypothalamus and into the posterior pituitary, right? So remember, these hormones, oxytocin and ADH, they are produced in the hypothalamus, but they're stored and released from the posterior pituitary, right? So first one is ADH, antidiuretic hormone. If you look at the name of this hormone, antidiuretic, anti is meaning against or opposite or something like that. A diuretic is a substance. There are medications or drugs that are called diuretics, but a diuretic is something that promotes the release of urine, something that promotes the formation and release of urine, right? So if you have a hormone that is antidiuretic, right? Antidiuretic, are you making and releasing as much urine? No, right? So that means you're retaining more fluid, right? So you will decrease urine production, stimulate thirst, and constrict blood vessels. What do all three of these, what do you think they result in? Think something related to the cardiovascular system. If you decrease urine production, you're not getting rid of as much fluid. You stimulate thirst, you're bringing in more fluid. And if you constrict blood vessels, you make them more narrow, right? All three of these things are helping to increase blood pressure, right? Helping to increase blood pressure. And so we'll talk about this as we go through various lectures. We'll see how ADH is important for blood pressure and fluid regulation. Oxytocin. Oxytocin does a number of things. It can have prosocial effects, but it also has other physiological effects like the stimulation of uterine smooth muscle, right? So for uterine contractions during the labor process, Oxytocin stimulates those uterine contractions as part of that kind of positive feedback loop. It's also necessary for the letdown reflex, or the release of milk from the mammary glands. Okay. You also have the hormones from the, so remember both of those, ADH and oxytocin, they're made in the hypothalamus, right? Remember, you also have all of those other releasing and inhibiting hormones that are also produced in the hypothalamus, but those are traveling to the anterior pituitary, right? So those are traveling to the anterior pituitary. So those are all of our releasing and inhibiting hormones, right? So again, I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but remember, as you see them, if you see the term releasing, if you see the term inhibiting, that's going to tell you that it's coming from the hypothalamus and that it's going to stimulate the anterior pituitary. So if we look at some of these from the anterior pituitary, we'll see a lot of different ones, right? So those being released from the posterior pituitary, there's only two, right? ADH, oxytocin. Here we have several, right? So first one is thyroid stimulating hormone. Just based purely on the name, you probably know what it stimulates. It stimulates the thyroid, right? Go figure. Thyroid stimulating hormone. It's stimulating the thyroid, right? It is triggered by TRH, right? What is TRH? Remember, thyrotropin releasing hormone, because you know it's from the hypothalamus, right? So the pathway here is you have thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, stimulates the release of thyroid stimulating hormone from the thyroid, also called thyrotropin, and then thyrotropin, or TSH, stimulates the release of thyroid hormone from the thyroid, right? So you have all three of these. So it can be easy to get them confused and or mixed up with each other, because they all have thyroid, thyrotropin, something like that as part of their name. And so try your best to keep them clear and separate in terms of where they're coming from and what they're stimulating, right? So thyroid hormone as a hormone itself, we'll talk about this later, but it's stimulating an increase in metabolism, metabolic rate, protein synthesis, things like that, right? And so we'll look at that in more detail in a little bit. Next hormone is prolactin. We won't spend a whole lot of time on this one, but prolactin is stimulating the production of milk, right? So it causes milk production and the growth of mammary glands in females. In this case, it's released from the anterior pituitary. And if you look at the term prolactin, pro meaning promoting or in favor of, and then lactin is referring to lactation, right? Which again is the production of milk. So prolactin is stimulating that process. ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. This is coming from our anterior pituitary as well, but this is stimulating our adrenal cortex to release corticosteroids. So maybe something like cortisol, right, or stress hormone, something like that. And so CRH, remember CRH is from the hypothalamus, so what does this stand for? This stands for corticotropin. What is the R? The R is releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, right? And again, it's going to go to the adrenal cortex. Here in a little while, we will look at the anatomy of the adrenal cortex, and we'll look at some different subdivisions of the cortex, right? A few additional ones, you have your gonadotropins, and so these are FSH and LH, so follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. Both of these you find in both male and female, but they are stimulating different things in male and female, right? So in females, we have the development of the ovarian follicle and the production of estrogen and progesterone during the menstrual cycle, right, during the ovarian cycle. And then in males, you have sperm development and you have the production of testosterone, right? So you have both in both male and female, but they do different things. In males, you may also see luteinizing hormone, referred to as ICSH, or interstitial cell stimulating hormone. Right, which is the same thing as luteinizing hormone, but it comes, it has a different name in male because there's a cell type called the interstitial cell. Right, we'll talk about that when we do reproduction. Right, and then the last main one is growth hormone, right, or somatotropin. Right, so growth hormone again from the anterior pituitary. It can stimulate or cause the liver to secrete something called IGFs, or insulin-like growth factors, and these growth hormone and IGFs work together to also promote cell growth, metabolism, enhanced protein synthesis. So kind of in a similar way to, or in a similar way that we saw with thyroid hormone, right? So here's kind of a summary slide of all of our pituitary anterior pituitary hormones, right? So all the ones that we just looked at. Now, there are conditions in which the pituitary may need to be removed, right? So this is something called a hypophysectomy, right? So this, anytime you see this term ectomy, right, this is meaning to cut out or to remove, right? So if you know your anatomy, right, then you know that if you go into the nasal cavity and you go directly up, right, all of this is your sphenoid bone, right? So you have part of your crista galli would be kind of right in this area here, right? If you continue moving backwards, here's your sphenoid sinus, right? So here's that big sinus, and then here, there's that depression. That's your hypophyseal fossa, right? That's your hypophyseal fossa. So during these procedures in which the pituitary gland is removed, maybe because there's a tumor on it and it's causing the overproduction of a certain type of hormone, a clinician, a physician, a surgeon can go through the nasal cavity, through the sphenoid sinus, to this hypophyseal fossa, and begin to break this bone down and be able to remove that pituitary, right? Now, if you think about all the things we just talked about, right? So if you look at this slide, all of these things are coming from just the anterior pituitary, right? We also have the posterior as well, right? Remember, with ADH and oxytocin. So if you remove the pituitary, you can imagine all of the hormones that you're going to need to be replaced, right? So hormones are going to need to be replaced, and their levels are going to need to be monitored very closely for essentially for the rest of your life once you've removed that pituitary gland, right? So it is a necessary procedure at times, but it also comes with lifelong, downstream considerations, right? So we're going to stop here, and then we will pick up in our next part, and we will continue talking about some hormones. Specifically, we'll look at growth hormone.